We will now proceed directly to the presentation by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Dr. Thompson, would you please proceed?
Merci. Bonjour Madame la Présidente, Messieurs les commissaires. Mon nom est Patsy Thompson. I'm the Director General of the Directorate of Environmental Protection and Assessment at the CNSC. Excuse me. With me today are Ms. Kaiser Francis, the Environmental Assessment Specialist on this project, Doctors Julie Brown and Sun Nguyen, Geoscience Specialists in the Environmental Risk Assessment Division, Ms. Kay Claassen, the Senior Project Officer from the Waste and Decommissioning Division. CNSC staff have reviewed OPG's submission of the Independent Expert Group report on the relative analysis of alternative means. Today's presentation summarizes CNSC staff's review as presented in PMD 14P1.2. I would like to mention that the CNSC staff reviewed the report for the purposes, both for which, the purpose for which it was intended as an assessment of alternative means, specifically for this environmental assessment. And we also looked at it from the point of view of how the information could be perceived and understood by the public to judge the suitability of the geology for potential other sites. And that's, I think, the comment that, the context for the comments that we've provided. And so I will ask Ms. Kaiser Francis to continue with our presentation.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Joint Review Panel. My name is Kaiser Francis. I am an Environmental Assessment Specialist at the CNSC. The purpose of this presentation is to provide CNSC staff's review and assessment of OPG's response to the information request as prepared by the Independent Expert Group. The presentation will also discuss whether any new information impacted our previous recommendations and conclusions in panel member documents submitted by CNSC staff in 2013. The information request required OPG to provide a renewed and updated analysis of the relative risks of siting alternatives under alternative means requirements of the EIS guidelines. The analysis was to be qualitative, transparent, defensible, and repeatable. Options to be analyzed included the as-is facility at the Western Waste Management Facility, which is considered the status quo, an enhanced surface storage at the Western Waste Management Facility, also referred to as hardened on-site storage, the current proposed DGR in the Coburg Formation at the Bruce Power Site, which is the current proposed project, and a conceptual DGR in granitic bedrock of the Precambrian Canadian Shield. Furthermore, information required for a qualitative analysis of a conceptual DGR in granite bedrock was to be based primarily upon the extensive data and analyses available within the environmental assessment performed by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, or AECL, for the Environmental Assessment Panel for Nuclear Fuel Waste Management and Disposal Concept, also known as the Seaborne Panel. The relative risk analysis was required to focus on 12 pathways of harm, as indicated by the panel in the information request. The information request required an assessment of community acceptance of the alternative in the local and regional study area, as well as with outside the regional study area. The analysis was to be undertaken by an independent risk assessment experts. The independent expert group sought clarification on the assessment of community acceptance. The response from the Joint Review Panel indicated that a comparison of risk perception and risk acceptability among the four options should be provided. CNSC staff reviewed the responses provided by the IEG for this information request. CNSC staff used guidance documents from the International Atomic Energy Agency, including the Safety Case and Safety Assessment for the Disposal of Radioactive Waste, which is Specific Safety Guide SSG 23, published by the IAEA in 2012, as well as the CNSC Regulatory Guide G320, Assessing the Long-Term Safety of Radioactive Waste Management, published in December 2006. CNSC staff also carry out independent research on the safety of geological disposal. In recent years, this research has focused on sedimentary rock, building on previous research from the 1970s to the 1990s that focused on granite that could be proposed as a potential repository host rock type in the Canadian Shield. Furthermore, CNSC staff's assessments benefited from knowledge and experience gained from participation in the Seaborne Panel, which concluded in the late 90s. Generally, CNSC staff had no major concerns with the baseline information provided in the report. The information was adequate to complete the alternative means assessment required by the IEG. However, there were some specific statements made by the IEG that CNSC staff must clarify for the record. Staff's observations presented in the following slides aim to qualify or amend statements made by the IEG in the report, including the characteristics of granite when comparing a hypothetical site in the Canadian Shield to the Bruce DGR site, loss of institutional control and how it was used by the IEG in the assessment, the short-term risk of tritium exposure, which was not explored, and worker health and safety. I will now pass the presentation over to Dr. Julie Brown.
Good morning. For the record, I am Julie Brown. I am a geologist in the Environmental Risk Assessment Division. So these examples are important to note because they reflect on the introductory information about the geology that provides the main barrier for any deep geological repository. Some statements in the report that make comparisons between the proposed DGR site at the Bruce Nuclear Facility to a hypothetical site in the Canadian Shield are misleading, such as the one given in the example on the slide. All granite bodies in the Canadian Shield are known to be naturally fractured, and the details of the disposition, extent, connectivity, and aperture opening size of these fractures are uncertain, and no amount of investigation can reduce the uncertainty to zero. The same could be said for sedimentary rocks, yet there is no corresponding statement in the IEG's report. Some of these statements imply that limestones are not naturally fractured, yet limestone is known to be highly fractured in Ontario and elsewhere. This points to the importance of detailed geological investigations and research to support the safety case for a proposed DGR in any geological formation. OPG conducted detailed characterization of the site currently proposed for the low and intermediate level waste DGR. The Lac du Bonnet batholith in the Canadian Shield was characterized as a sparsely fractured granite during previous investigations into siting a DGR conducted by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited a couple of decades ago, with no significant groundwater flux, similar to what the IEG cites on page 11 for limestone at the Bruce DGR repository horizon. AECL's underground research laboratory, now closed, was excavated in the Lac du Bonnet granite batholith. Granite observed at the underground research laboratory between a depth of 185 meters to 443 meters was described as essentially unjointed. This example isn't to be taken as a general characteristic of granite, but just that at a specific location, the host rock must be carefully characterized. The observation here is that out-of-context statements about rock types in general presented in an expert report may give misleading information about the suitability requirements for this and other DGR projects that may be proposed in the future. The IEG report assumes that active institutional control could be maintained indefinitely for both surface options. On its own, the loss of institutional control is not a pathway of harm, even though it has a strong likelihood of occurring in the future. It could in turn lead to three major pathways of harm: enhanced transport of radionuclides by water and by gas due to the deterioration of containment structures, and inadvertent human intrusion. CNSC Guide G320 on assessing the long-term safety of radioactive waste management states that, as a result of uncertainties associated with future human activities and the evolution and stability of societies, current international practice generally limits the reliance on institutional controls as a safety feature to a few hundred years. This is corroborated by IAEA guidance in SSG 23. Contrary to international practice and CNSC requirements, when considering the normal evolution scenario for the two surface options, the IEG assumes that active institutional control could be maintained indefinitely. However, in an IEG report appendix, it is estimated that loss of stewardship, presumably meaning the loss of institutional control for surface options, would result in a dose of 1,000 millisieverts per year for someone growing crops on land. So because of the high likelihood of loss of institutional controls for the two surface options, the risk assessment results for transport of radionuclides by water and by gas should therefore be portrayed as having a high consequence for timeframes in excess of 100 years, and not as having the medium-low consequence as estimated by the IEG. Without active institutional control, surface options for the management of the OPG's low and intermediate level radioactive waste are not safe after a few hundred years. Canadian and international consensus is that institutional control cannot be guaranteed after a few hundred years. Consequently, those surface management options are not considered to be safe beyond that period of time and would therefore not be considered best practice by the CNSC. I will now pass the presentation back to Ms. Francis.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Kaisa Francis. Tritium gas is a potential exposure pathway over the short term and could have been considered by the IEG in its evaluation of risks, although it was not required in the information request. There is minimal information on actual releases of tritium gas as opposed to tritiated water from wastes at the Western Waste Management Facility and at similar facilities around the world. Risks from this data gap are nevertheless low due to the very low dose conversion coefficient for inhalation of tritium gas. Hence, the exclusion of these considerations by the IEG does not affect the report's overall conclusions. The IEG report contained some generalized comments regarding the relative risk assessment of worker health and safety in the short time period, indicating that the underground alternatives would be both more likely and more severe. While the 2012 data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor indicates that underground mines have a higher work-related injury rate, when broken down further, some underground mines have a lower injury rate than does the general construction sector. Further, the work-related injury rate associated with underground mining is generally associated with the actual mining activity, i.e. the moving of rock materials, which for a DGR would be a short period relative to the overall operational period. Whereas the surface facility options, constructions of new buildings and demolition of old ones will occur on an ongoing basis over the entire operational period. CNSC staff conclude that the overall likelihood and severity should have been rated as similar for both above ground and underground options. This completes CNSC's presentation on the baseline information in the IEG report. The remaining few slides will focus on the overall CNSC staff assessment of this information request. As indicated in PMD 14 P1.2, CNSC staff found that the assessment was carried out at a relatively high qualitative level. The risk assessment methodology used by the IEG was determined to be sound and in line with multi-criteria decision analysis, an approach that CNSC staff considers to be adequate and have accepted for options analysis in a number of other projects. What is important to note, and I will reiterate this at the conclusion of the presentation, is that the concerns that CNSC staff have raised with respect to the response to this information request do not affect the current safety case that has been reviewed and accepted by CNSC staff for the proposed DGR project. I will now focus the presentation on the portion of the information request regarding the relative risk perception or risk analysis of the 4 prescribed alternatives. In PMD 14 P1.2, CNSC staff noted that the response provided an accurate overview of the concerns and positions expressed by both the public and Aboriginal groups in the submissions to the Joint Review Panel, both before and during the 2013 hearings. However, CNSC staff note that the response does not take into account CNSC staff nor OPG responses and information provided during the lead-up to and at the 2013 hearings. We understand that this information request is looking to describe how the community views the different options. However, the responses and information provided by the proponent and the regulator, as well as other government organizations, may have impacted community views. Risk acceptability is highly dependent on community trust in the regulator and the proponent. It is CNSC staff's priority to ensure the protection of health, safety, and security of people and the environment. Furthermore, a part of CNSC's mandate is to provide objective, scientific regulatory information. Regardless of the alternative that is being assessed, it is also important to note that OPG is required to have a public information program. The Nuclear Energy Agency 2012 document titled Geological Disposal of Radioactive Waste, National Commitment, Local and Regional Involvement also outlines best practices. In CNSC staff's opinion, the activities performed by both CNSC and OPG staff within the communities, both prior to and since the license application was submitted, conform to the following practices: openness, clarity, accountability, independence, and competence. These characteristics contribute to trust in regulatory institutions. At this time, CNSC staff must stick to topics and criteria found in our mandate. In the previous 2 slides, we have indicated how CNSC staff provide objective scientific information to the public and Aboriginal groups. As noted in a previous record of decision published by the Commission, social acceptability is not a criterion that appears in the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. So this concludes the slides on this topic, as there is no criterion that exists in the safety-focused regulatory framework of the CNSC to provide further review. To conclude the presentation, the final 2 slides will focus on whether the information provided in the response to the information request has impacted the previous recommendations provided by CNSC staff to the Joint Review Panel. With respect to the conclusions and recommendations submitted in PMD 13 P1.3 regarding the review of the environmental impact statement, no new information has been submitted that would impact the conclusions for the review of alternative means under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Furthermore, the long-term safety case assessment and conclusions remain the same. Turning to the conclusions and recommendations presented in PMD 13 P1.2, the review of the license application to prepare a site and construct, the information provided in response to this information request also does not change the conclusions presented in PMD 13 P1.2, and CNSC staff remain satisfied that OPG is qualified and will make adequate provisions to protect persons and the environment. That concludes CNSC staff's presentation, and we are available to answer any questions the panel might have.
Thank you very much.